A lot can be learned about self-reliance by visiting local attractions like plantation homes, farmhouses, and things of that nature. Recently I went to visit Tryon Palace, which is not far from my home, a couple hours away, and in this video I'd like to go over some things that I learned from that visit, so hang around. Hey y'all, welcome to Prepper Friday. I'm Gray Madden from Self-Reliance Publishing, and in this video I'd like to go over some things that I learned on a recent trip to Tryon Palace. Now, Tryon Palace was the governor mansion of North Carolina when North Carolina was a colony of England. And back in that time, while Tryon Palace was not self-sufficient 100% in any way, form, or shape, they did have quite a bit of trade, and the governor of the state, or the colony at that time, did quite a bit of traveling personally. They did have many aspects of self-reliance, and I'd like to go over and share a few of the things that I learned on my visit there, or some things that I observed while I was there. I didn't necessarily learn all of these things, but just some observations from a trip there. I would like to convey my observations, but I would also like to encourage you to go visit some similar places, whether they be farmhouses or plantations or whatever you've got in your area. Make a trip out of it, make a event out of it. I went with my beautiful Latin princess, and go with your significant other, your family, whatever, make a trip out of it and make it an educational opportunity and see what practical tips that you can glean just by visiting and making an outing out of it. I got my observations broke down into 3 different categories, and I'm sure I missed some things, which makes for the opportunity to go again. But the 3 sort of categories that my observations fall within are food, household, and trades. Food, they did a number of things. The governor actually had a plantation that was a couple miles outside of town, outside of New Bern, where he raised, or his farmers raised, the majority of the food for the palace and its guests. That being said, they did do quite a bit of food production on the property as well. They had a dove's cote that was built, and so they bred and raised pigeons or doves for meat purposes to produce some meat on site. They also had a very large kitchen garden that they produced a lot of the greens, vegetables, herbs, and whatnot that the chefs use for cooking in the kitchen. Another observation is the kitchen was not attached to the main house itself. Well, it was attached, but with the breezeway, it was actually off the house a little bit, and that was done, it was designed that way to keep the heat from cooking during the summer months away from the main house, so that the cooking didn't heat up the main house. And that was done to a smaller degree around where I live as well. My great-grandparents, they had their stove in their kitchen on the back porch. So a lot of their cooking wasn't actually done in the inside kitchen. It was done outside on the porch, so that the heat from the stove didn't heat up the rest of the house during the hot summer months. So that's something to keep in mind if you're prepping for the future, if you're prepping for potential utilities collapse. You can have your grill out on the patio or out on the deck like normal, but also consider setting up a place with a little rocket stove or wood gasifier stove and a place to cook with a Dutch oven as well. And if there's a way that you can make it covered, that would be good as well. But that's an observation that I made that they did at Tryon Palace on a large scale back in the day that you can implement on a small scale in your personal home with your personal preps. When it comes to food preservation, they had a smokehouse on the property there that they used to preserve their meats. They also had a prop where they had like a 55-gallon drum or wooden barrel that had apples. But they didn't have the apples touching each other. They stored them with straw mixed in between. Like the saying goes, a bad apple spoils the batch. So they had the apples in layers, and they separated the layers and the individual apples with straw. So I thought that was a interesting thing that I picked up on that I might implement this coming year. I plan on building a little root cellar in the side yard here, and I'd like to buy, because my apple trees aren't producing yet, I would like to buy a couple bushels of apples and store them in a root cellar and see how that works for me long term. But if you separate them out with straw, which is apparently what they did back in the day at Tryon Palace, it isolates the individual apples, and if one goes bad, it prevents the rest of the apples in that barrel, in that drum, from going bad as well. So the next category of observations dealt with the household. And one thing that I noticed was the chamber pot. All the bedrooms had a chamber pot by the bed, so if the governor or his wife or his guests had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, they didn't have to run all the way out back to the outhouse and get woken in the process. They had a chamber pot right by their bed. Along with that chamber pot, they also had a wash basin above it, and that's where they'd wash their hands, if that was even a thing back in the day. But it's where they bathed that night as well. All of their bathing was sponge baths. They didn't have showers. They didn't have full bathtubs where they could be submerged. All the washing that they did was with a towel, and it was a sponge bath. It's hard for a lot of us to fathom staying clean and staying sanitary without a shower or a bath of some sort, but that's what they did back in the day. And if there ever is a disruption of the utilities and local water and whatnot, and you're operating with rainwater or stream or whatever your source of water is, you might not have gallons upon gallons of water at your disposal whenever you turn on the tap. So you're going to have to conserve that water that you do have, and one way that you can do that is by taking sponge baths. It's kind of common sense to a certain degree, but if you're not raised that way and you've never been taught to think that way, it might not dawn on you. So that's just an observation that I made as well. Something else that I noticed was fire buckets. Chances of fire were probably even greater back then than they are today, due to the fact that heating was done with wood and coal, cooking was done with wood and coal, and light during the evening hours was obtained from candles and lanterns. So there's just an overall greater chance of catching something on fire and burning a building to the ground. Well, fire extinguishers weren't a thing back then, and they didn't have fire trucks, so what they did to help combat that and to put out any accidental fires that did occur was apparently all the homes back in that time had a number of fire buckets, and these fire buckets held either water or sand. Apparently sand was a preferred thing to store in the fire bucket because there wasn't any danger of it evaporating with time. But you keep the sand in there to toss on the fire and hopefully extinguish it. And your next round you could fill it with water and use that to douse a flame. So that's also something that, again, sort of common sense, but something that you might not have thought of if there was ever a situation where you didn't have fire extinguishers available and you were cooking with wood and using candlelight. Unfortunately, it didn't help the Tryon Palace. The palace that's standing today is actually a reconstruction of the original palace. It's built on the original foundation, but it did burn to the ground. I forget what year. I want to say late 1700s or late 1800s. I forget. But there was a fire and it did burn to the ground, and what's there today is a reconstruction of it. My third category of observations are the trades that were important to them back in the day. One that is exhibited at Tryon Palace today is a blacksmith shop and blacksmithing. Back in the day, they didn't have the blacksmith shop on the premise, but they did have one in town, and it was an important and integral part of that society. It is how they made a lot of their cooking and cooking utensils, a lot of their tools. All of their nails were made by blacksmiths for building things. Knives in the kitchen were made by the blacksmith, and so the blacksmith was an important person in society back in that time. Another one would be woodworking. They made wooden spoons, furniture obviously. They didn't produce everything on site or in that town. Like I said, there was a great deal of trade back in the day, and I think there's always going to be trade, but it might become limited to a certain extent, and you have to have the ability to produce the things that you need in the event that you can't trade for them, can't purchase them. So that was another one of my observations, those two trades. So overall, the point of this video was not necessarily to convey my direct observations from this particular trip, although I did want to do that. It was more to encourage you to do something similar with your family, with your loved ones. Go visit a farm, go visit an old plantation, and see what you can learn during the process. You might be surprised at the amount of information that you can glean, and even if it's not necessarily how to do something 100%, it might spark the idea and give you something that you should pursue, and something that skills that you should develop, and possibly things that you should purchase in order to help you be more self-reliant in your life and more self-reliant with your preps. Hopefully you got something out of this video. As always, I appreciate every like, every comment, and every subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.